I want to do is to take you through a new framework. It's not a model, sorry. There's a big difference between models and frameworks, right? Which is currently the working name for it is the estuarine framework, right? So that's a reference to an estuary. An estuary is a point where a river meets the sea, but it's a mixture of salt and fresh water. Whereas a fjord, for example, is only salt water, or a delta is only fresh water. So just to expand on the metaphor a bit, in an estuary, the tide goes in, the tide goes out. The water doesn't always flow in one direction. If you have a low-powered boat, you can cross the estuary at the turn of the tide, but you can't do when the tide is running. There may be granite cliffs that you have to check maybe every 10 years, and sandbanks which change every day. And then you've got this complex mixture of salt water and fresh water. It's called brackish, in English, and very complex ecosystems. So we're using the estuary as a metaphor for what a system is about. And to some extent, it's against Bejan's concept of constructional law, the idea that everything flows in one direction. In fact, it was named in reaction to that. Yeah. And there is this tendency to believe that everything is going in one direction. It's a linear flow. Everything branches off everything else. That is called arbitorial, tree-like. Yeah. In complexity, which I'll explain in a minute, we deal with what are called rhizomic systems. Rhizomic systems are where everything is networked with everything else. Everything is entangled. You can get new shoots forming from different root systems. Everything moves in different directions. And emphasizing that difference because it's an important one. So generally, we define a complex system as one which is deeply entangled. The concept of entanglement is important. And no, I don't mean quantum entanglement. That's a whole different discussion, right? So one metaphor that we use for that, Alessio Giraro came up with this idea that a complex system is like bramble bushes in a thicket. So a thicket is English for a small, dense woodland. And bramble bushes are those things which produce wonderful fruit, but sort of twist and twine around the trees, and they have thorns and they're very painful. So bramble bushes in a thicket or a mango swamp, these are good metaphors to understand the entanglement of a complex system. Everything is linked with everything else. Everything interacts with everything else. The only thing you know with absolute certainty about a complex system is that whatever you do will have unintended, which actually means you're responsible for them. If you know that's the only thing which can happen. Yeah. And what that means is you want to do lots, and this is an agile principle, lots of small interventions very quickly, so that the unintended consequences become visible faster, and the cost of abandoning them or amplifying them is much lower. And I'll illustrate something I'll talk about later. If you have a $500,000 project, nobody dares let it fail. If you start with $550 projects, most of them can fail. Now, that's actually an important principle, and it illustrates one of the ways we do complex systems design is we do smaller things faster up front, but we do them in parallel, not in sequence. And that's the difference with Scrum. And then we see which are going to succeed and which are going to fail. Now, again, I'll come back to that in a minute. So a complex system is deeply entangled. The Greek origin of the word complex actually does mean entanglement, whereas the Latin origin of the word complicated actually means folded. And of course, if something is folded, it can be unfolded and folded again, it doesn't change. If something is entangled, you can never take it apart and put it back together again. So the other thing about entangled systems is they have high levels of what's called path dependency. So basically where you are, you can't go back and start again. You have to always go from where you are. Whereas within a complicated system, you can reset and start again. And it's that recognition of the present, which is important. Now, because, and another metaphor we use a lot, and I sort of build in some language here. If you can imagine a set of magnets on a flat surface, electromagnets, which can change in polarity and strength. Some of them you can control, some are controlled by people you're aware of, some you've got no idea whether they're controlled by any conscious person or not, but they're changing. And in the space between the magnets, there are lots of cast iron weights of varying sizes, varying densities, some connected, some not connected. Yeah, everybody got the picture? So if all of the magnets keep the same strength and the same polarity, you've got a stable pattern. If I change one of the magnets, I can predict what will happen to the pattern. If I change two of the magnets, I can predict what will happen to the pattern. If I change three of the magnets, it's no longer predictable. Three-body problem, which is actually where complexity comes from. And of course, all of the magnets are continuously changing, and some of the metal weights are getting magnetized as they go through the magnetic field, so they're acting as secondary attractors. And that is a really good illustration for what a complex system is about. Everything is connected, everything is influenced. And what we say is the magnets are effectively modulating the system. We don't talk about causality, we talk about modulation, which is a key phrase. Yeah? Now, it doesn't mean I can't manage it. Yeah? If I actually can see the patterns in real time and I can change enough of the magnets, then I can either influence or control the patterns which will emerge. But I've got to know what the modulators are, and I've got to have real-time access to the data. I can't do it on a predictive basis, on a retrospective basis. So one of the big things we talk about in complexity theory is creating real-time sensor networks. This is in the EU Field Guide on how to manage in complexity, which I was the principal author on. It says you need to use your employees as a sensor network, and you need to be able to access them in real time, because you need to see the patterns as they're starting to emerge. You can't wait for them to be visible with traditional scanning. In the literature, this is called weak signal detection. Right? So a complex system is modulated, it's entangled, it can't be predicted, it has path dependencies you have to manage from the present. But the key phrase here is we manage the evolutionary potential of the present. The other thing you can't do is define an ideal future state. Now, this is actually what systems thinking does in the main. It defines a future state and tries to close the gap. Complexity says, well, if I can't understand what's happening, then defining the future state is just what we call in Britain pie in the sky. If it's in the sky, you can't eat it. It's a waste of time. All right. What we have to understand is not talk about idealistic future states, but find better ways to describe the present and identify the pathways which we can influence in the present. So in a very real sense, we start journeys with a sense of direction. We don't try and achieve goals. And Estuarine mapping is all about mapping the current state of affairs. Not about sitting down and deciding where you want to be. It's starting by saying, where are we and what can we actually change? So that's kind of a principle. Yeah. The other thing about a complex system is you're constantly monitoring for emergence. Now, emergence is one of the most misused terms in the whole of Agile. It's often used, oh, it's emergent, so we're not responsible for it. Well, sorry, that's not the case. If it's emergent, you have higher levels of responsibility. Yeah, the fact that something is emergent doesn't mean that you can't sense the emergent pattern early and you can't choose to give it more or less resource. So emergence is something which has to be managed. And there are three necessary but not sufficient conditions for emergence. I'm going to introduce some new language here, so I'm going to try and restrict the new language to 3 or 4 words, but this one is important. You have to have lots of what are called actants. That's A-C-T-A-N-T-S. So an actant is anything in the system which has agency. I'm not using it in the same sense as Latour for the philosophers amongst you. I'm using it in the artistic sense of the word. So when I went to an appalling production of Macbeth at the Royal Shakespeare Company last night, which was badly overstaged, all right? But the stage, actually, the stage setting is an actant. So all actors are actants, but not all actants are actors. Yeah, so actant is anything which has any degree of agency or influence in the system. If it's a person or a body or a human team, for example, it's called an actor, but the generic term is actant. Yeah, and one of the things we do in design is we design systems, where we design processes or actants, which actually can control how people behave. So we're quite good at this as a species. So a complex system has to have a significant number of actants. There then have to be highly rich, highly local interactions between the actants. And the third thing is that none of the actants must be aware of the whole or think they're aware of the whole. Which is why talking about thinking holistically generally means you don't understand complexity theory. Because actually you can't think holistically and you can't act holistically because there are so many variables in the system, you're just deluding yourself. And the danger is you do think you're thinking holistically, you have an objective, you then bias the results into what you personally think should happen, and you miss emergent possibilities and you miss outliers. And some of you will know the famous example on this. If you give radiologists a batch of x-rays, ask them to look for anomalies, on the final x-ray you put a picture of a gorilla which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% of radiologists will not see it, and the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. Yeah, we do not see what we do not expect to see. Yeah, and therefore what you actually want, and this is the thing, you want things which monitor for emergence. And there's difference between having that perspective, looking at the patterns from on top, and believing that you understand the system holistically, because you can't, and you can't direct it. But you need to monitor the system. And the monitors ideally shouldn't be actants in the system, because then it biases it. The other bit we often talk about as well is scaffolding. So scaffolding is a basic structure that you put in place. So I'll give you some examples. If you look at a building, we put up steel scaffolding, yeah, in order that the building can be erected, but then we take the scaffolding away at the end. Yeah, there are also nutrient lattices. If you have a bad burn, the medics will put a nutrient lattice over the burn that provides a scaffolding around which the skin can regrow, but it also feeds the growing skin with nutrients and it dissolves in the process. That's another type of scaffolding. Yeah. An endoskeleton, which an insect has, which is an external skeleton, that's scaffolding. All right. We have endoskeletons, we have internal skeletons, which actually scale to much bigger creatures and allow more variety, but it still provides a basic underlying structure. So scaffolding is something in the system, designed or accidental, which creates some type of permanent structure or stability within the system. And you do this with laws. So for example, in the UK, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. In Germany, they drive on the right. That's actually using the law as scaffolding to create certainty. So this creates what we call the AIMS framework, which is actants, interactions, monitors, and scaffolding. So that's framework number one. Yeah, those are the things you need to understand, create, and map. So that's one principle. The second principle, and this will lead me into estuarine mapping, is that magnets, or the modulating elements, really fall into two categories. One are constraints, and we got various typologies for constraints, but I'll keep it simple for the moment. Constraints can either contain or they can connect. So remember I talked about an endoskeleton connects, but it doesn't contain. An ectoskeleton, like an insect, contains, but it doesn't connect. Yeah? Now, actually, if things are contained, they're stable. If they're connected, we're not quite sure where the boundaries are. So that's another complicated, complex decision. And it's also important not to see constraints just in terms of Goldratt's theories of constraints. When Goldratt uses the words complex and complicated as synonyms, he uses them interchangeably. And he sees constraints as things that you remove. Now, nothing wrong with that in the context of where he was writing, what he was doing. No disagreements, love the books. Yeah. But in evolutionary biology, without constraints, evolution doesn't happen. Yeah. Without constraints, everything is equal, probably nothing changes. So in biology, constraints are positive as well as negative. And that's really important to understand. So at a simple level, we say we need to understand what the constraints are in the system. And constraints at a simple level can be containers or they can be connectors. The second thing we need to look for are constructors. Now, this comes from theoretical physics, from Deutsch's work. This is from quantum mechanics. This is constructor theory in theoretical physics, which you're welcome to look up. The model is originated in constructor theory, but I'm not going to get into the physics, all right? I'm going to keep it at this level. So a constructor is something which transforms things in the system. So it's something which sits in the system, which allows transformation, either by passage or by contagion. So, for example, a process is a constructor because something comes into the process and it comes out differently. In that context, Scrum is actually a constructor. Yeah, it's a rigid process with a set of protocols. You put something in at one end, you get something different out at the other end. Yeah, in humans, ritual is a really powerful constructor. So if you look at when people go into an operating theatre, they scrub up, they wash their hands. That isn't just a hygiene factor. They're also changing their identity so that they become a surgeon rather than who they were when they went in. that ritual changes them so that they perform a role which they've been trained to provide. Right? So rituals, processes are examples of constructors that change by passage, things go through them. Contagion means what it says. It means you see something and you get excited about it, so you try and copy it. Yeah. So putting people close to a constructor, which they find attractive, will mean they try and copy it. Yeah, the constructor doesn't change in the process. So basically, constraints contain or they connect. Constructors transform by passage or by contagion. Now, we're building a really simple typology here because we don't want people talking about, I know what's happening or I know what we should do. What we want to do is to start off by saying, what are all the constraints and what are all the constructors? So we're looking at, this is granularity, we're looking at a much finer level of granularity than the whole system. Remember that point about emergence? We don't want knowledge of the whole because then we'll miss weak signals. And for the philosophers amongst you, by the way, this is actually in Deleuzian terms a deterritorialization technique. If you get that, you'll understand where I'm going. If you don't get it, don't worry about it. All right? I just want to make that as a marker. Right? So what we do is we start off with some sort of initiation process. We may look at what effects exist in the system. We may look at problems we've got, stories gathered from the field. And we say, in all of these, what are the observable effects that we can see? So things which are happening in the system. That's what I mean by an effect. Yeah. And then we attribute those to constructors or constraints or combinations of constructors or constraints. So we'll look at an effect and say, oh, we got these three constraints and we got these two constructors. Right, we write those down. So we're using the effects to identify as a stimulation to identify constructs and constraints. We're also, by the way, at the same time identifying actors or actants, and we're going backwards and forwards. So this is a sort of iterative recursive process. Identify things every time you identify something new. Say, does that change your perception on something else? So we're trying to get this really rich body of constraints and constructors. And then we'll have some effects left over which we can't attribute. And that's called dark modulation, which is a reference to dark matter in physics. I got an effect, but we can't see what is influencing the effect. Right? That actually is then a measure of risk. So in the process, once we got to this stage, we're going to split the team into two. A small team will work on all the effects for which we cannot attribute to a constraint or constructor, and we'll try and actually find ways to attribute them. What's left over becomes a measure of risk. The more you can't attribute, the higher risk you are going forward. The rest of the team then actually place the constraints on a grid, and I'll show you the grid in a minute. Yeah. The grid is, the vertical dimension is energy cost of change. The horizontal dimension is the time required to change something. So let me give you a couple of examples. If you want a London taxi driver, remember the black cab drivers in London? The way they're trained is they drive around the streets of London in their own time at their own expense with a map of London strapped to the handlebars until they know the name of every street and every major landmark. And the test is to be given any 2 points in London and describe the route out and the route back, turn by turn from memory, yeah, mentioning all major landmarks. It has a 40% pass rate over multiple attempts. The energy cost of creating London taxi drivers is very low for the City of London. It's just an examination panel, which is supplied by the taxi drivers. But the time is 2.5 years, because that's how long it takes the hippocampus to physically change structure to handle that level of knowledge. This was one of the first cases where we discovered the body plays a large part in consciousness. Yeah? So I've got low energy costs, but long time. If I introduce sat-navs, I've got a very high energy cost because they'll cost me a lot of money, but I can do it in lower time. You start to see the principle here? And saying, what have I got? What can I place? Yeah. And so what I end up with is a map, and this is where we hope to God this works. Yeah, it did work when we tested it. But, right.
As you think, if the characters just change your
Then okay.
So what we got is a grid. So we got vertical dimension is energy cost, and we allow negative energy on that, interestingly. Right? The horizontal dimension is time. So what actually happens is that the group...
There we go.
Yeah. Is it? enough on, yeah. So basically what I've got a grid, energy cost against time. And those little hexes are all constraints or constructors. We also mark them up if they're high impact, if they change. Now, there's a key principle here, which is about getting agreement in that if people can't agree what a constraint or constructor is, they break it down until they reach agreement. Nobody's allowed to compromise. It's keep breaking you down to agree. The same is true on this framework. You break it, if you can't agree where it's placed, you break it down until you agree where the placement is. So you may end up saying, well, this constraint in this context is positioned there, in that context is positioned there. So the goal is, as far as possible, to have a framework where there is complete agreement on the content and nobody is actually compromised. And this is a complexity principle. I'm breaking down to the lowest level of what's called coherent granularity. I want lots of small things. It's easier to reach agreement. Yeah. And that's actually quite an efficient process. It saves a lot of time and effort. I end up with this grid, and then I draw 3 lines. So the first one, the top right one, is the counterfactual line. Now again, counterfactual has 2 meanings. In narrative work, it's an alternative history. In physics, it means something which can't change. So everything, and I'll use the compass now for this, everything to the northeast of that line, i.e. upper right, are constraints and constructors where the energy cost of change or the time to change is so high that realistically they're not going to change. And that in itself is a real switch. We don't sit and talk about how we'd like things to be. We first of all start off by working out what we can change anyway. Everything to the southwest of that line are things that we could theoretically change. So that is also can be called an affordance landscape if you want to use the language. Now we've recently added another line there, liminality, because what we found in groups is that they would say, well, we can't change this, but somebody else might. So the stuff between liminal and counterfactual is in the group. We or people we directly influence can't change this, but somebody else could. That's actually produced hugely valuable. We did a big one with one of the big pharma companies, and they put a load of stuff in that. I pulled the CEO in, he took one look at it and said, well, of course you can change that stuff. It's just nobody's ever asked me. And we didn't ask him to change it. We said, if we can make a case, would we be allowed to change it? That's a very important psychological difference. Right? So at that point, we could move the liminal line further up. Yeah? The bottom left line, vulnerable, what that basically says is anything effectively to the southwest of that line is actually really dangerous because it could, to use an American expression, turn on a dime. The energy cost of change, the time to change is virtually negligible, so it could just happen without us controlling it. So what I've now got is effectively 4 landscapes, 4 things done. Yeah. What we then do is there's then a series of actions, and there's going to be a brochure produced on this in the next week once I finish writing it. So we look at each of the individual constraints or clusters of them or constructors, and we say, do we be happy with where this is? In which case we stabilize it. So if we decide to change it, the energy cost of change and the time are perfectly acceptable, right? Tick in the box, leave it there. If it's problematic, then we might say, well, how can we lower the energy cost, but we're happy with the time? Or how do we lower the energy cost and the time? And then people work on a project to do that. They're not trying to solve the bigger problem. They're trying to change the energy cost of change. Some we might want to increase. We might want to say we want the energy cost of this to be a lot higher because we don't want it to change ad hoc. We actually want to make it difficult. Yeah. Some we might be able to say, well, we can change these. Remember the turn of the tide metaphor? If something else happens first, this will be easy to change, but until that happens, it will be almost impossible. Yeah. And there's a whole body of these action types, which there are forms that people fill out. And so what you end up with is 40 or 50 micro actions, not to solve the problem, but to change the energy gradient of the problem space. I'll repeat that. You'll end up with 40 or 50 micro actions, not to try and solve the problem, but to change the energy gradients so the problem can solve itself more readily. And put in a simple way, you want the energy cost of virtue to be less than the energy cost of sin. So you first of all focus on the energy gradient, not the solution. Now we've done a few of these now, and this actually is a transformed strategy. Because instead of everybody arguing about what they want, and we've had 2 or 3 cases where there was major conflict before we came in, they map the energy gradients and then they can agree projects to change the energy gradients and then see what happens. So they can put off that difficult decision because you can do things in the present which are more effective. So that's about changing the dispositional state. You're trying to create it more predictable, more structured. You're trying to control it. I'm going to Washington shortly. We're out back to run this with the red teaming guys. So we're going to do a red team, blue team version of this on a foreign policy initiative. So this is how the enemy see it. This is how we see it. That actually can be done between Agile, between management. You can create common constructor, common constraint lists. You can get different groups of people to map it so you can see how different groups perceive the energy cost of change and have a dialogue about that, which is powerful. We're also just about to introduce it in the coaching market. So what you do if you're a coach working with an individual or a team, you effectively map the affordances of the environment in which you're working. That's what the Estuarine map is. It maps the affordances, what's available to you. And the first thing you do is, instead of talking about, I need to develop these capabilities, you need to say, I need to reduce the energy cost of this, or increase the energy cost of that, or reduce the time of this. So again, you're looking at things from a very different perspective. Yeah. It's also, the third application of this is as a foresight technique, because basically whatever has the lowest energy gradient is likely to win. So instead of having scenario planning, forces and factors analysis, and you never know who's going to win that argument, you say, what's the energy gradients of the system? Well, let's look at whatever has the lowest in energy gradient, and that's the most likely thing to happen. And as I say, what we found when we do this, whether it's with an Agile team or a board of a company, is it allows a non-argumentative discussion about the space in which they're operating before they jump into conclusions. And actually, from a complexity point of view and a cognitive science point of view, if you allow people to assess a situation, they will always assess the situation to support what action they've already decided to take. That's a universal. So what we're doing here is we're preventing that happening. We're breaking it down into lots and lots of small things. We're placing the small things on a grid. We're agreeing how we move those around. We're initiating small projects to move things around. And then what is possible will become more visible to us as the system evolves. So it's actually almost like a form of disentanglement in some ways. So that's Estuarine mapping. Yeah. Cynefin as a framework was actually not a complexity framework, it's a decision framework. This is actually a complexity framework. It says a complex space consists of constructors, constraints, counterfactuals, energy counts, time counts. Yeah. What you need to be able to do is to control the environment in which you're working rather than focus on goals. And that's also called a vector. Effectively, we manage the evolutionary potential of the present. We stop trying to manage the goals. And that's why people like me oppose things like KPIs and OKRs, because all of them assume the system is ordered. If the system is complex, you can't actually measure something by output. You actually have to decide, is it going in the right direction at the right speed for the right energy consumption? And that's called a vector measure. Okay, so I've talked for about half an hour, which is what you wanted. Yeah, I've covered.
Thank you very much.
Open for questions.
I'm very happy that I recorded this all day, because I think I need to watch it again to understand it completely. But maybe some people already have some questions. So thank you very much.
Help you. There is a major academic article which I finished and was accepted. I'm quite pleased. It was 5,000 word limits. They accepted 9,000 words, which is the Oxford Handbook of Foresight, which will come out next year. So that's peer-reviewed academic. We'll be simplifying that into a simple how to do Estuarine mapping brochure with a facilitation kit, and that will be out at the end of October.
End of October, so this month already. This is October, not next
year. And
we
also, if you check, we've started the online training. We just sold out the first online Estuarine course. Yeah, there's one coming up in Washington shortly, and we're setting up a whole load more.
Wow, very cool. So